Welcome to the New York Salon and Battle of Ideas Satellite Festival event, Freedom of Speech, the Press and Beyond. My name's Alan Miller, I'm one of the directors of the New York Salon. The New York Salon has partnered with the Battle of Ideas International Festival and also here with Columbia School of Journalism, which we're very excited about. The Battle of Ideas International Satellite Festival covers everywhere from Amsterdam to Athens, Brussels to Berlin, Prague, Budapest, Oslo, Lisbon, across the UK, and these events in New York. So if anyone fancies also coming to the London event, it's between the 19th and 20th of October at the Barbican with over 450 speakers and a couple of thousand attendees. But we're very pleased to be doing this event here in New York today. So before I introduce our panel, just a couple of thoughts. Many people may have seen the introductory remarks on the flyer that we've sent around to people, but obviously there's been a great deal of discussion, as there should be, on some recent events and the discussion of freedom of speech and the press on both sides of the pond and internationally, as it happens, obviously. Everything from the discussion about the Justice Department seizing 20 journalists, AP, Associated Press journalists, telephone records, to discussion in the UK about the Leveson report and post-Leveson, and I know people will want to talk about that here and the implications. James Risen being ordered to testify at Jeffrey Sterling's trial, and also the New York Times reporter James Rosen labelled as a co-conspirator for reporting. But freedom of speech is not just about the press, so tonight I'm hoping that we can have a discussion more broadly about some of the questions of freedom of speech and how it relates to us, because obviously we're on a campus, a university campus as well, and we've seen a lot of discussion and debate over the last 20 years, as it happens, around the ideas of free speech, hate speech, speech zones and that type of thing, and it will be very interesting to hear people's views and thoughts on that. Now, obviously it's a very complicated discussion, but luckily for this task we have a really esteemed, fantastic panel joining us tonight, which I'm very excited about. Sadly, Professor Jay Rosen had to pull out just a couple of hours ago, but I'm going to introduce, and these guys have got really long bios, so I would recommend that you look them up, and they're very impressive. So, but I'm only going to read out a few points on them, but do look them up and read, because they're very impressive. Firstly, on my immediate geographic left is Eve Burton, who's not politically necessarily, obviously, is Senior Vice President and General Counsel of the Hearst Corporation, one of the nation's largest diversified communications companies, which obviously has magazines, newspaper, cable networks, televisions and internet businesses, as well as radio broadcasting. She's worked as Vice President and Chief Legal Counsel at CNN, and prior to that was the Vice President and Deputy General Counsel at the New York Daily News. Eve was also named as an outstanding woman by the Bar of New York County Lawyers Association, and in addition to that, she's a visiting lecturer of constitutional law and journalism here at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. I'll ask you to welcome them at the end, so we can do that. Next to Eve, we've got Stephen Segala, and Stephen oversees all the national and local programming from WNet's producing subsidiaries. So people will be very familiar with 13, WLIW 21 and Creative News Groups, and among those productions, household names such as Nature, Great Performances, American Masters, Secrets of the Dead, Need to Know, Religion and Ethics, Newsweekly, Cyber Chase, Real 13, and he's also executive in charge of the new PBS Hour Weekend. And finally, next to Stephen, we have Mick Hume, who is editor-at-large of the online magazine Spiked. He has a new book out, which is called There Is No Such Thing as a Free Press and Why We Need One More Than Ever. He was editor in the UK of LM magazine, which he launched originally as Living Marxism in 1988, until it was forced to close in 2000 following a libel suit. Interesting considering tonight's debate. He then went on to launch Spiked online in the UK, and he writes for various UK publications, and some of you may well have seen the piece he penned on press freedom in the US and the UK on the Columbian Journalism Review site yesterday. So can we just welcome our panel this evening, please? So we're going to get right into it, and we're all very interested to hear what the panelists have got to say, and I just want to echo some of the points that Jean said. Recently, when President Obama was heckled and interrupted by a woman on a very important subject on Guantanamo in May, he replied that these are tough issues, and the suggestion we can gloss over them is wrong. And whatever anyone thinks about President Obama or his policies, we share that view, that notion that some of these discussions are tough, but we need to get into the nitty-gritty of them and really interrogate the ideas, and that takes rigorous debate and discussion. And that we should thrash out these ideas, however controversial they are, which is surely a precursor to any action, if there were to be any action on them. And on the day when the US government has gone into shutdown, this probably underlines the issues all the more, because it's a very serious issue, and how we discuss important ideas and what the implications and the consequences are. And we very much go along with Thomas Jefferson's quote, when the press is free and every man is able to read, all is safe. So I'm going to introduce the speakers. They're going to do fairly short introductory remarks on the actual subject, and then we're going to come out to the audience and we're going to go back and forth and really engage. And as Jean said, this is very much about a discussion in the spirit of the old salons of Philadelphia and Paris, where we engage everyone in a discussion and debate.
Our once notable difference from the rest of the world in terms of the free flow of information to the public has been drastically challenged in the last decade, and particularly in the last couple of years, but it's been a trend. The greatest risk I would articulate for discussion and debate to a free press is what we can't see. We now have a general press corps and an American public that accepts the new reality of the First Amendment. And that reality is firmly grounded in the government's right to protect the country. So while there's always been over history times of civil unrest and freedoms for communication and times of terrorism and lockdown by the government, there's no doubt we are in a time period where the balance of power has shifted to the government in that debate. And we also, most interestingly to me, are in a time where the public and journalism has accepted that. So that's, to me, I think what makes this time in history different and what would trouble Thomas Jefferson. Not to be cavalier, the government's goal is critical, right? It is critical, and terrorism is a threat. But the biggest problem is the use of a blunt instrument to kill an ant that's 5 layers down in the ground. And so therefore, there's an awful lot of death, if you will, to rights and to debate that comes as a result of that blunt use of very, very powerful statutes, which keep us all in the dark in many very critical regards. So the real question of solving this problem, though, is even more complex. We now live in a world where media companies are no longer reporting and playing games of cat and mouse with the government. That was the usual way, and we had the law and we had judges to protect us. We now have an entirely new layer of what I would call third-party interests and issues. So I'm referring to Google, to Amazon, to telecommunication providers, to all of the vendors that now are intricately a part of every major and non-major media company. We're in a time where media companies are in an absolute crisis. They're going into bankruptcy, they're closing, they're merging. Some of the great journalism of the last decade and last 2 or 3 decades is not even known anymore. There's no foreign bureaus. There's not groups of people covering things. Everything is aggregated, and what you see is a shrinking amount of good quality journalism and ideas around the world. But even that which is really critical, investigative reporting, anti-corruption reporting, basic accountability of the government, following trials, and I don't just mean the high-profile trials, I mean trials that matter. All of that right now, there's an intermediary, and that is these telecommunicators, these technology companies, right? So right now you have the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal have moved all of their email to Google Mail. It's a B2B enterprise solution, all happily sitting on Google servers. Now Google says all the right things. From time to time, one notices in the press that trust but verify might actually be a good approach. But in any event, all of that information, all of Jim Risen's information, take any major, I use Jim just because you mentioned him, Alan, sit on the Google servers. So now all of a sudden, for the first time, the government has access and doesn't have to deal with the general counsel of the New York Times. I mean, talk about a home run bonanza, right? And imagine if you say to a media company, don't put your things on Google, don't use AT&T or Verizon without very clear protections. And as someone who has worked hard on protections, let me tell you, it is complex, and we'll talk about that later if people are interested in it, because we have come up with some creative solutions. But if you're on the verge of bankruptcy, or your cash flow is down 80%, or you're struggling to survive, and I'm talking about the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, I'm talking about major media companies that provide a tremendous service to this country and to the world. And you have to choose between going on to Google Mail and an 80% cost savings. It's very, very difficult to have a principle. So let me just tell you, and I give you one example, and to Alan's point, we want to have a dialogue here. But let me give you an example of exactly where I think the rubber hits the road. So let's just use an example of, and this would be relevant to Amazon, Google, Yahoo. I mean, those leaders lease, as you know, space from the government for their private planes. They get discounts on oil and gas for their private planes. Some companies like Amazon have connections and relationships with the CIA. So that, remember, the technology companies are an integral part of consumer business right now, which would be us, business enterprise, selling things to companies, and the government. They are one and the same, right? So cloud services for the government, cloud services for media companies, it's all on the same servers. They're all mixed together. So here's the troubling example. So let's imagine, for example, Maureen is a longtime coverer of gang violence in San Francisco. And there's an ongoing investigation, as there always is, to gang violence in every city in the country. And the government would like to follow, as they do every day on the website and in the papers, exactly what Maureen's covering. She's got the best sources. She knows about the subject. She's had numerous interviews over the years. She, in fact, was in charge of putting an entire gang into prison for 20 years. So what does the government do? They go and they say to Google, we're making a very narrow request. We'd just like to have the email that's sitting on your servers relating to Maureen, and over a 2-week period, anything relating to this subject. Very narrow by any definition. And by the way, you can't tell Maureen that we're asking for it because this is an investigation. We're going to stamp on the subpoena. It's a highly secret grand jury investigation. Now at Hearst, we get 200 of these a year, right? This is basically bread and butter for us. We move to quash them all. We win all of them. The 25-year-old lawyer at the technology company says, boy, it says secret, and it's an investigation, and it's a grand jury. I can't even give them notice, you know. I gotta shoot this over and just give it to the government. You know, I'm obligated by law to do this. I'm obligated by law to do this. Off goes Maureen's material to the government, and Maureen doesn't even know it. The general counsel of Maureen's media company doesn't know it. The government never tells them, never tells Maureen, never tells her company. Google never thinks another thing about it because it's one of, 200 subpoena requests that come in a day. Fast forward, trial against one of the now indicted gang members. Maureen has waived her rights because the government has her email. Maureen is now a critical witness because the government has been able to learn all about Maureen's reporting. So Maureen is now actually called to testify in the case. 5 years fast forward. Maureen doesn't exist. Gang reporting doesn't exist. Quality local journalism about important issues is potentially dead or highly challenged. That is the problem.
Okay, thank you, Eve. A lot to ponder there. Stephen.
Thanks. I was rather hoping I could just sit and listen to Eve continue with the narrative. Let me give you some context about myself, because you've already heard my first few words in speaking in my English accent. So I spent the first half of my career as a journalist in Britain, not at the BBC, in commercial television, And I guess I've now spent the second 3/4 of my career in the US in public television. And these are strikingly different environments in a whole number of different ways. And they sort of inform my experiences as a journalist and as an editor, in effect, an executive producer of journalistic content, which is what I've done mostly. As Alan said, I'm in charge of all of the programming that comes out of WNET these days, but I've probably spent more of my time doing journalism and journalistic documentary current affairs programming than any other type. In broadcasting, there is, of course, a tremendous hurdle you have to overcome, which is that you have to have the means of distribution. It's not the same any longer. One of the most critical differences between the environment and the industry in which I learned my trade and the present one is that there are no barriers to entry. There are also no barriers to expression. Anybody can say anything and publish it immediately on the internet, on the web, of course. When the only outlets are commercial broadcast or state or public broadcast licensed by your friendly local government, there are rules that are established of how you conduct your business, how you conduct your journalism, and within what kind of parameters. An example from my career in Britain, I worked for Granada Television, a company that has subsequently swallowed all of commercial broadcasting in Britain and is now essentially the same thing as ITV. There was a weekly current affairs show. We made a program about a then highly contentious national strike in the British steel industry. The basis of our reporting was a huge collection of documents that were leaked to us by a source inside the British Steel Corporation. And before we could actually broadcast the program, it became necessary to tell the company that we had the documents so that we could actually force them to answer the questions that arose. The documents demonstrated that they were lying in public, and indeed so was the then government, the Conservative government. The great fear at that time, because it happens from time to time, was that we would never get that program on the air because the courts would often permit a company or a potential subject of your journalism to enjoin the broadcast, to get an injunction, as it's called, and prevent you from broadcasting it. There are a number of celebrated cases in Britain where that was the case, that happened. It didn't happen in this case. What happened instead was that after we broadcast the program, and frankly, it was the naivety of the British Steel Corporation as to how bad the story really was that meant that we went ahead, I think. After the program, we spent 3 or 4 years fighting one court case after another where the British Steel Corporation essentially sued us for the return of the documents, to reveal the source, to pay them some invented sum for damages to their reputation and to their business. And the problem was there's no protection in British law for journalists to publish information because of in the public interest. And so you are on really thin ice in Britain if there is no First Amendment which permits you to publish. Conversely, today, the world I'm in is one in which the pressures are quite different. Firstly, working in public broadcasting, as we all know, you don't need me to tell you, we live in an entirely precarious world. We're not a for-profit business. We don't have shareholders. We certainly don't have investors who are willing to prop up our work because they think it's valuable. We're begging all the time. So a second example is that about 10 years ago, I co-produced a fairly serious, substantive, probing documentary series about the oil industry. It was called Extreme Oil. In one of those episodes, there was a segment about Alaska, which the then senator, the now late Senator Stevens of Alaska, really didn't like. And one of the consequences of that was that the whole debate about the funding of public broadcasting was reignited, as it so often is, by one small incident. And so rather than being fearful of the intervention of some party before you might publish, here you spend a lot of time dealing with the consequences of publication. But the great outcome of that was that every fact we had in these programs was true. The defense that it was in the public interest was apparent. And finally, the problems went away. When I look at the people entering the industry today, and we hire people, not least from this august institution, they have an entirely different set of expectations, because if we don't want to publish their work, leaving aside whether we give them a job or not, but if we don't want to publish their work will be published. They'll publish it themselves. They have no, there are no restraints, but there are still consequences. And one of the things I try to tell everybody who works for me is that I expect our journalists, as journalists, to have no politics and not to be in the business of expressing themselves. They can express themselves somewhere else. But as I know, it just begs the question, how do you define journalism? But in the School of Journalism, I trust we can accept that we sort of understand what we mean by journalism. And when we understand journalism, my view is that we're not talking about freedom of expression. We're talking about the right to publish journalistic stories and material that may have very severe consequences and for effects on those we write about. And our responsibility is about getting it right, getting the facts right, and being factual at all times. I'm alarmed by some of what I see in terms of free expression, because it is unfettered, and it is, of course, an opportunity. The complete freedom of expression online, or indeed standing out in the street, provides free expression for bad ideas and hateful ideas, as well as good ones, and as well as defensible ones. That's just life. The technology hasn't changed the fact that that is a reality of human nature. The technology is a gigantic megaphone, and it's terribly distressing to know that if you Google the word Jews, the first 3 ranked sites you'll find are hate sites about Jews. But that too is just too bad. I wouldn't for a second suggest that they should be suppressed. That's freedom of expression. That's fine with me, but I always think it's important in this kind of discussion to separate freedom of the press and the rules that govern journalism from freedom of expression, which is mostly about opinion. I'll stop there and listen to.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And over to you, Mick, please.
Thank you very much, Alan. Delighted to be here in New York in such an august surroundings. I come at this from a slightly different point of view. I'm a print journalist, now an online journalist, and also an unashamed propagandist, which doesn't mean the same thing as liar, if you go home and look it up. I started in the left-wing independent press when there was such a thing in the UK, and then for 10 years I was a columnist on The Times, being paid the Rupert Murdoch shilling, which of course obviously disqualifies me from having any reasonable opinions on anything in the opinion of some. My view on this, I just want to talk about some of the cultural issues, I think. It has been said, of course, that the Brits and the Americans are two people separated by a common language. So if you don't understand what I'm talking about, please do let me know. But we do have a very close history together in terms of the struggle over the issue of freedom of speech and a free press. The English revolutionaries and radical Democrats were very important in terms of inspiring the American revolutionaries, who then became a beacon of freedom and freedom of speech for the world. So we do have a very close and common history, but it's a history which these days we are separated, rather, I think, by the fact that the UK has largely forgotten its history in terms of its role in developing the idea of free speech and freedom of expression. So we in Britain have the worst libel and defamation laws in the civilised world, which are so bad that American courts refuse to enforce their judgments I speak from personal experience in this. As Alan said, I actually lost a job in a magazine after being sued for libel under a law which basically says that you're guilty until proven innocent and that the truth is no defence. So we're left with that, and something so bad that the state's courts won't even enforce the judgments. Or perhaps even more starkly, you have the 45 words of the First Amendment to the Constitution, and we have the 1 million words of Lord Justice Leveson's report into how the state ought to be regulating what can and cannot be published in the British press. When I suggested in these many debates that I've had around my book and around the Leveson inquiry into state press regulation in Britain, that when I dared to ask the question, why do we need any special rules and regulations controlling what can and can't be said in the press, a journalism professor, no less, said to me that the idea of having an unregulated press came from another planet. So which I pointed out to him, was he referring to the other planet, the United States of America? But I think, so on one sense, you know, that we seem a long way apart in terms of the situation with the freedom of the press and freedom of expression in Britain and America, but I think there are still some common problems and challenges underlying it, and I'd just like to talk a little bit about them for what little time I have left. On the one hand, there is the problem of government and state interference, surveillance and policing, which Eve and Alan have already talked about, and which is a very real problem that I won't bang on about with examples now, although we can discuss it obviously. But I think the other thing I'd like to talk about is what seems to me to be an increasing cultural hostility to the idea of freedom of expression and a free press. The fact that free speech is increasingly, it seems to me, out of fashion, especially in those which consider themselves to be fashionable liberal circles. And the danger we're facing is not so much kind of rampant censorship as a very sanitised and conformist public discussion. There are two problems, I think, which are common on both sides of the Atlantic today. One is that the kind of mantra of the moment has become, of course I believe in freedom of speech, but, and the buts are getting bigger as you list all those that you think should be excluded from the freedom of speech that you claim to uphold. It's basically a way of saying free speech for me, but not for thee. And I think that's an increasingly common kind of issue that you'll find in discussions. And the second problem, I think, is an attitude which I define as the culture of you can't say that, which is an attitude of not engaging or arguing with ideas that you find objectionable or offensive, but simply saying you can't say that. That idea should be delegitimised. It should be taken off the table, off the arena, out of the arena altogether. It's basically something that, and it's usually done in the name of defending one minority or vulnerable group or another, and it's really something which I see as being a kind of intolerance in the name of tolerance. It was captured by, there's a bloke called Boris Johnson, who you may have seen, a rather clownish character, who's the Mayor of London, who actually is not a clown at all. That's the whole shtick that he kind of gets away with. But he banned some Christian, basically anti-gay adverts from the buses in London on the basis that he said, we will not tolerate intolerance. And nobody could even see apparently the irony in that idea. So you can't say that. Intolerant tolerance, I think, is a cultural attitude. Now, there are many examples of these problems which I haven't got time to go into in the UK and I think in America. But just very briefly, in the UK, just a couple of examples. The discussion of the press, the way in which the phone hacking scandal at Rupert Murdoch's News of the World, which nobody wants to defend, became the pretext for an all-out assault on the unethical tabloid press, which is now seen as unacceptable to those people for whom popular is basically a dirty word. And they have used that as a pretext for trying to purge the press of everything that they object to. It's something that I describe in my book as a process of ethical cleansing. And it's been pursued by the kind of liberal voices one might, sorry about that, it's been pursued by the kind of liberal voices that one might otherwise have associated with freedom of the press. So that's one very stark example of what's going on. But it's right across British society now, everywhere from Twitter and Facebook. Twitter, which calls itself in Britain the free speech wing of the Free Speech Party, has actually become almost like the most conformist wing of the conformism movement. Anybody who says anything objectionable now on Twitter can not only expect to be hunted down in a kind of Twitch hunt by thousands of other tweeters demanding that they withdraw their remarks, but also reported to the police. You know, there are examples of people being arrested, prosecuted, and even jailed for some ridiculously distasteful remark they've made on Twitter or on Facebook. Because you can't say that, you literally can't say that. And it's even reached football, sorry, I refuse to call it soccer, football, where there's a major national debate taking place now about the fact that one London team very close to where I live, Tottenham Hotspur, their fans refer to themselves as the Yid Army. And that's their slogan in the stadium. And now there's a major campaign by the football authorities to try and stamp that out and have that banned and make it arrestable, because the argument is that it doesn't, the fact that they say that as a badge of pride doesn't matter. The context of words doesn't matter. Words in themselves can be wicked and must be suppressed. I mention that because we're in New York and some people may have some interesting opinions on that discussion. In America, there are a whole blanket of other kinds of discussions. Alan talked about some of the things about free speech zones and campus speech codes and so on. But one of the things that really worried me most when I was reading some of the recent American discussion was an annual survey that one institution does of young people's opinions in America about issues of liberty and freedom of speech. And the latest one claims that 47% of educated young Americans that they asked said they thought the First Amendment went too far. 47% said the First Amendment went too far. Now, as someone who is accused in Britain of being, they call me a First Amendment fundamentalist, and that's supposed to be a criticism, by the way, in the UK. It's really shocking to me that so many people who have the First Amendment should wish to somehow rewrite it to limit it. I would like to argue that we ought to start a movement that says that the First Amendment is not enough. Because in the end, it is only still a piece of paper, and as we've already heard, it can be got round, and governments can override it in certain circumstances. And what we really need is a kind of cultural revolution to put back on the table the idea of freedom of speech and freedom of the press with no ifs and no buts. Thank you. Now, can I go one more minute?
Yeah, go for it.
Just to explain this. You see, because these are very difficult questions, which we all have to grapple with. But the truth of the matter is that freedom of expression and freedom of the press cannot be divisible. Like all liberties, they're indivisible. You can't say, you know, I'm going to abolish slavery, but only for white people and Christians. Right? And you can't say we're going to have press freedom, but only for the Guardian or in the UK or the New York Times or the respectable media. You've got to defend these things for all or for none at all. You know, freedom of expression and freedom of the press, these are not things that anybody has to pass an intelligence test or an ethics test in order to qualify for. It's not something to be handed down from above like charity. Freedom means that. It means that a free press or somebody speaking on the web or whatever doesn't have to comply with my idea of what they should be saying or your idea or anybody else's idea. And that's a really hard kind of truth to grapple with. But, you know, free speech and a free press is for idiots and gormless individuals as well. As for good people, and that's the truth of the matter. As George Orwell, an Englishman that I hope some of you have heard of, wrote in 1945. He wrote when he wrote Animal Farm. He wrote an introduction to it called "The Freedom of the Press," which ironically was not published with the book, and it's only been published about twice ever since. But you can find it online. And in there, Orwell made the point that if liberty means anything, it must mean the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. And that it's got to be the bottom line that anybody who's serious about the future of a free press sticks with. And I'd like to encourage an attitude of what I call true tolerance, which means being prepared to listen to arguments that you find objectionable and offensive, because that's the way we're going to get closer to the truth, is that we can have a proper clash of ideas. But true tolerance doesn't mean in some caricature way sitting there saying, oh, I disagree with what you're saying, but I respect your right to say it, and not arguing with the other side. You know, true tolerance is a way of having a fight of ideas to the death, in my opinion. And I'd just like to leave you with the words of another Englishman of letters from a slightly earlier generation, Samuel Johnson, who said that every man has the right to utter what he believes truth, and every other man has the right to knock him down for it, at the very least, figuratively.
Thank you, Mick. So I want to get straight into this, actually, because Stephen, you made a distinction which I think is important when you were talking about freedom of expression generally, and lots of people writing and saying lots of things. Some of it's ludicrous, some of it you think is could be offensive and insulting, but there's obviously a distinction with quality journalism of the two. But to what extent would you say that Mick's point that he's making, that there needs to be a general defence overall of freedom of speech, is right in that context, or wrong? How do you see that?
No, I don't disagree with Mick at all. I think freedom of speech is a superlative value. You can't have a bit of it, and you can't have mostly some of it. It either exists or it doesn't exist. But the distinction I was making is, which I do think is important. It's almost a separate subject, or these are two separate subjects. Is freedom of speech is one thing, and how journalists behave, and how both in response to, or even worse, for fear of what may happen to them if they conduct their business in a fearless way. These are two separate things. I try very hard to, as I'm now as you mentioned, I'm now the executive in charge of the new PBS NewsHour weekend. We're now in our 4th week, so we're just coasting along nicely. And Robin McNeil and Jim Lehrer are paragons of being as unbiased and non-opinionated journalists as they can be. None of us can leave our opinions at home. We're all human beings, but as professional journalists, I'm not in the freedom of expression business. I'm in the as best I can factual reporting business. And when people infringe on my ability or right to report factually, as Mick said, there is this extraordinary thing in Britain with the libel laws. The truth is not a defense. If you say somebody is a villain, and it's true, that's still not necessarily a defense against a libel accusation. That's silly. That's crazy, and it's unbelievable that still remains the case.
Eve, you made some very chilling insights into some examples of what can happen with email information, and we've obviously seen a lot in the light of WikiLeaks and Snowden and the NSA and all of that. But I have another question, which is, because it seems to me as well in America that everyone formally is much more into free speech, the points that Mick made about the Constitution, First Amendment, but then we see things like, to talk about the Twitter example, drunken remarks about gay people or racist slurs, and then suddenly there's a slightly different position, it seems. And then, in the UK, a student was imprisoned for some of the comments that were made, not by actually doing something beyond speaking about things. And so to what extent do you see the relationship between the formal protection of the rights and these broader things that are happening?
I'm probably the dissenter here, I guess, in terms of, freedom of speech as distinct from freedom of the press. I think that is a good distinction. I think we live in a time where there's more freedom to say whatever you want, responsibly or irresponsibly, without anyone shutting you down. As a practical matter, the number of people saying nasty things, let's call it nasty, generally defined, is far greater than it ever was, and people are not going to jail anywhere in Britain or the U.S. in far greater numbers, to the point where it's a critical problem in my view, right? So I actually don't think the libel area is a big deal. I think basically we win those cases in this country, and Britain has been a problem forever in that regard. I don't see it changing much. Britain has always issued prior restraints. They continue to issue prior restraints. When you think about, the bad journalistic acts that occurred, and we can be critical, they were bad at Murdoch's operation, it's remarkable how much noise there is and how little change there's actually been. I'm familiar, I've read all 1,000 pages of the report that you mentioned, but, in the end, I think there's far more discussion and therefore tolerance, right? I mean, people are more honest, perhaps, but more tolerance actually by the government and by people in authority than I worry nothing about libel and defamation, very, very little. But I come back to this critical component of news gathering and the ability to get information and the ability to know what's happening with your information. I view it as an absolute crisis for the First Amendment because it can't protect what it can't see. And there's no balance of power that's protecting it, right? We used to have judges, and we used to have the government, and we used to all be able to see what we were fighting about. That is gone. So I don't find the naughtiness a problem. I think actually, we're going along just fine. That the marketplace of ideas, we should debate it. I think the fact that we now know, to your point, that, hate speech is at the top of certain Google searches is far better than not knowing it, right? So from my point of view, I see as a theme across knowing versus not knowing, and I'll take knowing any day.
Okay, but it is the case, is it not, that on campuses in America and also now in Europe and also in the workplaces, things that you are allowed to say are not allowed to say because it will be offensive, and also the way you look at people. Even there's something called elevator eyes. Now, without getting too far off the subject, the whole notion of speech codes and free speech zones and non-free speech zones. That's an informal kind. It's not a government censorship kind, but it is it not, a chilling of free speech and the ability to say what one wants? Is it surely not better to hear what people actually say and engage with them in the discussion rather than saying you're just not allowed to say it?
Absolutely, but my point to you back would be we're hearing more from more people who aren't very interesting too, frankly, than I have ever heard in my entire 25 years of being a First Amendment practitioner. So I don't see it as a problem. I guess that's where I'm contrarian to your idea.
Okay, I mean, last year at the UN, President Obama made a speech saying that there should be marginalization of outrageous ideas and things that are inflammatory, that are hate speech, and actually something should be done by government leaders. And he was specifically referring to hate speech towards Muslims and Islam. But that sense in which whether it is that you're jumping on an Israeli flag or you're banning academics from speaking, or there's a general sense in which the climate that we're in affects and impacts the climate of journalism and free speech. There's an interesting intersection there, I think. Is there not, or are they both completely separate?
Well, I don't actually accept the distinction between freedom of expression and freedom of the press. I think historically, freedom of the press, which meant the printing press, was fought for as a way of expressing, as a practical means of having freedom of expression. That's what it was about, and it was first of all about freedom of religious expression. One of the striking things that I find today is that the 17th century English Puritans, who actually led that demand in the first place and inspired many of those who came to America, seem to have a better idea of what freedom of expression might mean than many so-called liberal-minded people do in Western societies today, which is a bit of a sad testament. But I think that freedom of the press is the practical, and I'm talking about the press in all of its forms now, and online is obviously the future in many ways. Freedom of the press is the practical expression of freedom of expression, and journalism is really just the paid for, or often now the unpaid for, practical manifestation of freedom of expression. And I'm comfortable with this argument because it's used the way of trying to get around the freedom of the press argument in my debate in the UK over the Leveson inquiry and everything. Well, people say, there's a philosopher in the UK called Professor Honora O'Neill, who's a very famous kind of ethics woman. And she made this point that the freedom of the speech is not the same thing as freedom of the press, because freedom of the press is about making money, and freedom of speech is about expressing honestly held opinions and everything. And this was seized upon by all the supporters of new press regulations, saying what a brilliant insight it is. I mean, it's an idiotic idea. And as I said to them in a meeting with them, are you suggesting that the Guardian should have freedom of expression because it loses money, but the Sun shouldn't because it makes money? I mean, freedom of the press has always been very closely tied up with the attempt to make money from the first time that anybody print, and it's become, as Eve says, harder and harder to make it pay. But I don't accept that distinction. I do accept the distinction that Stephen's talking about, that you can't just have people twittering and pass it off as being serious journalistic news. In fact, I think the problem, it seems to me, is that far too much of the news now is dependent on what somebody said on Twitter. You actually get news reports about a discussion that's been taking place on Twitter, kind of extraordinary business. I think there's far too much of a confusion now between, there used to be, there's that old saying about comment is free but facts are sacred. That was a kind of newspaper view of newspaperman's view, and it seems to me now there's been far too much of a confusion of the two. So you do often find what's supposed to be a report is infused with how the reporter feels about the subject that they're writing about, which is in its own way a way of telling you how you ought to feel about the subject that they're reporting. I think that shouldn't have a place in factual news reporting, and an opinion, which I'm all in favour of, and actually was what I do most of the time, needs to be kept separate from that. And there's been a very dangerous conversion to the two. The objectivity debate, just finally on this, is very interesting because giving lectures to journalism students in the UK a couple of years ago, I was a bit, there wasn't a lecture, so it was a debate, and I was a bit shocked to discover not only that everyone said objectivity is impossible, which we all know that objectivity is a big problem for anybody that's trying to report. Not only did most of them think it was impossible, but they also thought it was a completely worthless, dishonest idea to even attempt to achieve objectivity. That wasn't a goal that should even be seen as being realistic. And I said to them that if you really believe that, then I suggest you quit your journalism courses and go and sign up for poetry or being a playwright or something, because really, if we can't have any serious professional strand in journalism, then we are lost.
I want to come out to the audience fairly soon, and I'd like people to have a think about this distinction, if there is one, about being offended and free speech and tolerance and what that means. I mean, I have a question about this because often in Britain and in the US, there's been what they call a multicultural debate, and sometimes, particularly on campuses, political correctness, and what would give rise to offence, and to what extent one should respect things one does not agree with, or is that the same as tolerating it? And what do people think? I'm interested briefly if anyone wants to come back on this on the panel. I mean, and then I'm going to come out, and then I've got one more question from the panel. But to what extent should we respect? I'm often told that you have to respect if someone wants to say something, or if they want to wear a particular item of clothing, or whatever it might be. If one believes in freedom of speech and expression, is that true? Is that what tolerance means?
What somebody wears? What do you?
Yeah, to respect what someone, if someone says, you have to have respect for the content of the conversation, or for what they're actually saying in the context. So is that the same thing as tolerating it?
I'm not sure I have a very strong opinion about this. I mean, in the workplace, in the workplace, you asked this earlier. I hadn't heard the expression elevator eyes before, and I'm not quite sure I know what it means. In the workplace, if you want to say something rude to somebody you work with, whether you think they're ugly or you don't like them because of the color of their skin, you'd be well advised not to say it. Because, to quote Dr. Johnson, they have the right to knock you down. And now that's not a good thing in the workplace, generally. I think people get tied in terrible knots respecting people. I think the rule is you should respect people as individuals. As soon as you start respecting groups, then somehow that something different enters into the thinking. And some groups, plural, are not so compatible with each other. So I think it becomes more and more difficult. I don't know that I can define tolerance other than there's the golden rule, and there's that good old English phenomenon, good manners.
Okay, thank you. Mick?
I'm all for good manners. I think that's very important. But
Splendid.
I'm not saying I'm in any way embody good manners. Far from it. But I think like objectivity, it's a very good idea to be striving for. But what I think, I mentioned Orwell before, and one of the problems with these things is that the meaning of words is completely turned on its head. So tolerance, the point I was making was that tolerance has become an excuse for a liberal form of intolerance. In other words, my tolerance means you can't say that because that's not respectful enough of other people. Whereas what I think a genuine tolerance ought to mean is a willingness to entertain and listen to ideas that you find objectionable or even offensive, and then knock them down with all of the force you have at your means at your disposal, because that is the way you get close to the truth.
But that happens more than ever now. That happens more than ever now, right? We have internet, we have chat rooms, we have the ability to put hate speech on, we have the ability to knock it down. I mean, I find it sort of interesting that you feel that the times that we live in, that this is a big issue. I think there's a distinction between honesty and harm. I don't mean physical harm, but an honesty and harm. And maybe that's where, I draw a line. But I do think the marketplace of ideas does a pretty good job. And I don't think we have much regulated speech in these two countries that we're talking about.
No, it's a question of an informal culture, is what I'm saying, of you can't say that. Look, on BBC television last weekend, BBC, right, the most boring, conformist television channel in the world, which is held up as a great banner. And of course, yeah. Sorry, I'm just trying to wind you up there. The football lunchtime discussion was talking about an incident that happened on a pitch with two players got into a kind of mock fight. There was some scratching involved. It was all very low-level stuff. And one of the pundits who was on talking about it, a bloke called Robbie Fowler, who's an ex-striker himself, said in his charming Scouse way, they was pulling each other's hair like a couple of girls. They then went to the next item. When they came back, Robbie Fowler was forced to apologise on air for the offence that he'd caused to the female half population, and particularly women who might be playing football, and to it was basically humiliated in front of the entire country for using what is a kind of completely meaningless expression about football. And the club that he used to play for, Liverpool, has just published a list of words which the stewards who control the crowd during the match, or the police who come to the match, are to take as being banned, and are to have someone removed from the crowd if they use those words. Those words include not only the obvious offensive words which we could all think of and wouldn't like to discuss, but also things like man up, you're playing like a girl, etc., etc. And it just, the list is endless. Now, this is a cultural revolution that's taking place underneath the surface, everywhere from online discussion to football. And something like, the reason I'm upset about football is because, it's one of my great passions in life. But what's interesting about it is that it used to be the one place where it was accepted that normal conventions of speech didn't hold, and people could behave and talk at a football match where they would never do outside of that. Now you have the reverse going on, where football crowds are actually being told that they have to follow stricter rules than those which apply outside of that. And basically a kind of dinner party etiquette is being created. And that's a major change in our culture.
Okay, so I can see a lot of people indicating, and I'm going to take them on this side first and here. I also want to do a little straw poll. It's probably silly, but in the room, how many people think the First Amendment has gone too far? Okay, that's good for being honest. Well done. Okay, well, obvious minority, but that's probably what one might expect in this room. But okay, so the other thing I want, I see a row of hands. So please feel free to make points. You don't have to just ask questions and come back on any of these issues or raise some of them. So we're going to start here. There's a microphone. If it's actually on, so if you want to come up and just do it from there, or maybe Jean can unhook it potentially and pass it to you, and we can hand it along. It's already switched on. There we go. Thank you very much. Just to this lady at the front, please, Jean. Thank you.
My question is to Eve. I'm sort of curious to find out about the strategies and tools that you were talking about to protect content that you said that perhaps we could talk about later on, how to protect journalists and how can they sort of protect their content online. Also, and another question that I have for the three of you is, in the last 10 years you said there's been a huge assault on freedom of press. Whose presidency really do you think has been most dangerous to the First Amendment, the Bush administration or the Obama administration?
Okay, thank you. Can you pass it along? There's a gentleman on the second row in the brown shirt who's indicated. Keep your hands up so I can see, and we'll just get around.
So that's actually...
Can we take a round of questions or points, and then I'm going to bring you guys back in. Is that okay? I'm writing them down. Yes, the gentleman there.
I had two questions. One was, I wondered if the panel thought there was a distinction between toleration and respect, and what the difference might be between toleration of people and toleration of ideas. And whether the marketplace of ideas, if there is such a thing, should be governed by the marketplace, or the same economic forces that governs the marketplace of commercial goods, if the term holds consistently in the phrase.
Okay, thank you. Directly next to you, the gentleman there. Thank you.
I just had 2 points to make. I'll start with the football first. I'm just curious. You know, I agree with you that football stadiums are amazing places, but I don't think it's acceptable by any convention to have sort of football players racially abused because they're African American, and for you to think that those conventions from 20 years ago are acceptable now. I think that's complete rubbish. The second thing that I wanted to raise was this difference between the personal freedom of expression and the freedom of press. There's a distinction here that what I say personally or feel personally only goes to a limited number of people.
You had mentioned something earlier about objectivity, and I'm seeing objectivity from another side. I agree with you that being objective obviously is an ideal to be strived. But I'm also seeing a use of the idea of objectivity as something of a fetish, at least in the discussion of the American press, that the easiest way to stifle dissent or cut off a debate with between journalists, or the sort of the round table thing that's become more and more popular in American media, is to claim a lack of objectivity and to simply say that your opinions are so out there on the fringe that we can't take you seriously, therefore you don't really have a place in this discussion at all. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about objectivity from the other side, using objectivity as sort of a stick to beat back dissent and disagreement. Thank you.
Okay, so we've got a number of key points there. I mean, is it acceptable or not to have an African American abused? Is it a relic of the past? A distinction between toleration and respect, and what does that mean? Or any of the other ones that were, anyone wants to bring up. Do you want to go first, Eve?
Sure. So the question, at least the one that was directed at me relating to the Bush versus the Obamas, I would say it's government versus government. Government by its nature is a beast that prefers secrecy. It just can't accept anything else. And so, I mean, the White House menu is classified information, top secret classified information. So by that basic paradigm, I think it doesn't much matter. I will tell you that practically speaking, at least from the point of view of the press broadly defined, the Bush administration was far better than the Obama administration has been. I mean, the Obama administration, and again, I give Eric Holder quite a lot of credit. He's not popular in the press, but a small group of general counsels went down and had a conversation with him about the DOJ guidelines, which relate to when the press gets an opportunity to defend itself before the government uses its information. The AP case you were mentioning, Alan, this conversation occurred afterwards, and he agreed to change entirely, for the first time ever, the guidelines. So you have the Obama administration, who hasn't been very good. You have Eric Holder, who's criticized highly, but if you really look at the facts, he's done a pretty good job for the American press. And yet, in the end, it's government versus government. So I would never believe that, I would never support it. I don't think it's a political thing. I think it's a DNA. And remember, the government is far beyond the political appointees. I mean, as the generals will say, the presidents come and go, and I'll stay. So, and then secondly, to your question of some creative ways to deal with the third-party problem and people having your information, it's all brand new, so it's untested. But imagine a world. I mean, my example that I used wasn't even talking about the national security instances where there's a real government interest, right? A real government interest. I was speaking more about the day-to-day reporting, but one of the things we are working very diligently with some of these technology companies to do is to allow us, if they don't believe they can give us notice that they're going to turn over our information to the government, we will identify in advance certain counsel that will be hired by that telecommunicator, but with the total job of defending our rights. So think of it as sort of a guardian ad litem in a proceeding with children, right? The kid between two fighting parents gets a ad litem who goes to the court and at least makes the arguments. And everything's sealed in those instances, and oftentimes the parents don't know what's said. Same thing here. Maybe they go into a FISA court, make all the arguments, but the point is we'd have an advocate, right? We'd have an advocate so that if you lose, you at least have a check and balance. And I think the most important thing for freedom of the press in the institutional sense, and I mean that in terms of the government versus individuals, is absolutely a check and balance. So that's what we would get with that new suggestion. And Google, I have to tell you, has had a sea change in their thinking through the dialogues we've had with them over the last month. So I'm hopeful that this will happen. I don't know that we win these cases, but at least we'll have somebody there advocating for us in the event we can't know.
Well, just on that point as well, what would you say to people who said, like, for instance, the amount of freedom of information requests has increased, but the rejections has increased significantly? When I first came here, it was just after 9/11, so the Patriot Act and a lot of discussions around homeland security, people were fairly outraged about it, and the discussions about library records and everything. But many people have made the comment that, surprisingly for a law professor, that President Obama has extended a lot of those, some people would argue, draconian measures in terms of freedom of information and the discussion in the press. I mean, would you say that you're saying that you do not think it's significantly worse than under Bush?
I think the government is a beast that's far beyond the particular leader. I don't think Obama, I think the Republicans are just better at being sneaky, right? So I think, Obama gets caught for everything. So but when you actually add up the tally, it's probably pretty close. Honestly, Alan, I think we have never been able to have access to national security information. It's never been cases we've won. We've never had access to it for the Freedom of Information laws. But I do believe that we know that now more. And I believe the risks are higher because of this new tolerance, if you will, for the new reality of the First Amendment. And we have at least one believer here that the First Amendment has gone too far. So I think, the fact that the American public generally believes that it's okay for the government to keep things from me. I'm okay as long as I'm safe, and I believe I'll be safer. I'm good with that. I'm good with that. And that, I think, is more the issue than Obama versus Bush.
Okay, thank you. Stephen, you don't have to comment, but if you...
I was going to say two things which I hope are somewhat responsive to the collection of questions and comments. One is to revise what Mick said. In the US media, we've now reached the point where opinion is cheap and facts are expensive. Opinion is free, forgive me, I've mangled it, and facts are expensive. There are, as Mick said, so many hours of content now, especially on cable channels, which consist of people chit-chatting about their opinions instead of anybody going out and doing any reporting, that has two very negative effects. One is just the obvious fact that there's less reporting going on, so we're getting less information. If we had a little more information, maybe we wouldn't feel so comfortable about saying, well, national security, that's a pretty big deal, so I'll accept some restrictions, and I'll accept the government reaching into people's cloud and looking at their emails. On the other hand, there are some subjects where, and when you only have information that's sort of driven by one side, or one side of the argument, or one powerful entity, and you have very little information from the other side, there's also the obvious point of who's in favor of national insecurity. There's no constituency for that. Now, maybe there are some. I mean, I was in an edit room this afternoon looking at a piece, and I said, I'm not sure about this. These statistics about infant mortality, perinatal mortality, and mothers dying in hospitals, from Amnesty International. They're now the New England Journal of Medicine. And the other person in the room said, well, are you saying we should have somebody speaking in favor of maternal mortality? And I said, no. But I want to know where this information is coming from and what their position is and why they have that particular point of view. A related thing is that this sort of opinion versus reporting thing is that journalists only become really successful in the visual media in this country if they cross the line from being reporters to being celebrities or being opinion mongers. And I can tell you, in working in public television, having tried to hire anchors for news and current affairs programming in the last half dozen years, all the names that are suggested to me are people who are anchors of shouting programs, and I won't even consider them. And it's the numbers of people who have worked in their entire career in journalism and media doing journalism are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And that's a real challenge.
Thank you, Mick.
Yeah, I was talking to one of the top tabloid journalists in the UK who was saying that he thinks that in the end their paper will end up being opinions and jokes because they can't do any stories anymore, partly because of the economic constraints, but also because they are terrified of the backlash that's been created around the Leveson thing, and they have these internal procedures now about compliance, which are far more rigorous than any kind of external regulation. And basically, they try and do any story that's too controversial or too questioning. It's likely to be knocked out before it gets done. So, I think there is a real threat to investigative journalism. And I agree with you entirely. Also, seen about the way that these words are used. You know, who would be in favour of national insecurity? The other one that they use as a club to kind of beat you into submission. It's like the other one I come up against all the time is this argument for ethical journalism, which basically means journalism which I approve of. You know, because who's going to say, "Oh no, I'm in favour of unethical journalism"? That's what we need. Is more of that. And they're kind of words which are used as clubs to beat you into submission. Just on those 2 points that were raised over here directly at me. One about racial abuse at football matches. Of course, it's not acceptable or tolerable. That's why it doesn't take place at English football matches anymore, because the crowd won't put up with it. It wasn't any law that stopped football crowds throwing bananas at black players. It wasn't any code of regulation introduced by the football authorities. It was the people at the grounds themselves. The world changed. The country changed. Britain is not the racist country it was when I was a boy, when racism was not only acceptable in the suburbs where I live, but it was pretty much obligatory. What's interesting about the kind of speech campaigns around football in Britain is the less racism there is at football, the more campaigns and regulations and laws there are against it, which demonstrates to me it's really about something else. It's about trying to kind of create, to sanitise things rather than dealing with an actual social problem. It's also the case that when I was a mad young radical student, racism was about power. It was about, you know, challenging police brutality, about challenging immigration crackdowns on immigration groups and so on. Now it seems about policing the language of footballers and people standing on a football terrace somewhere. It's a trivialisation of the issue, and it's one which has serious repercussions. The other point, just quickly, about you made the point about you know, the danger of irresponsible press inflaming people, and this is an argument that I hear all the time, and I'm very suspicious of it because, and I noticed. The great Pulitzer quote outside the hall there makes the same point, effectively. It makes the point that a bad press will eventually create a people that are as base as it is. That basically, that if you have a bad press, they will create a bad public. It's a kind of monkey see, monkey do view of what people are like. And what it demonstrates to me is that, in the end, and it's a whole chapter of this on my book if you're interested, prejudice and feeling against popular newspapers is always undertinged with a fear and loathing of the populace. But basically, that's really what you're saying. The danger of these newspapers is that they're firebrands, they're inflammatory. Well, of course, they're only inflammatory because you think the public are a bunch of wooden-headed puppets that are capable of being inflamed by something that a tabloid newspaper says. It's a very dangerous idea, and I think it shows a lot of far too little respect for the opinions of the public themselves.
I'm going to come back out. I just got one question to you about this. I'm going to be in Prague soon talking on this, and in 2009 they passed a resolution limiting what could be said in the press off the back of very gratuitous images and discussions about children. And it was really initially a discussion and debate about protecting the rights of abused children that then got generalised to impact a discussion about what could be covered by journalists. And Mick, in your book, you talk a lot about, and I'm not sure if everyone's followed what's happened post-Leveson with some of the Metropolitan Police roundups and things like that, but you talk about what happens with tabloid journalism, and you wrote a piece about if this happened in China, there'd be an outrage, basically. I think you used a different word, but I'm going to choose my words differently. But basically making...
That was a quote from a journalist, it wasn't me using that language. Right?
Yes, indeed. And could you just give us a little, just come back a little bit on what you think that, because a lot of people have discussed in the press, and I'm sure everyone's aware of the David Miranda being arrested, and Glenn Greenwald, and the Guardian now, and the New York Times, and that whole discussion. But you make some points about tabloid journalism that gets less attention. So if you could just give us a couple of points on that, would be interesting. And then I'm going to come back out on this side.
We have a situation alongside the phone hacking scandal, as I say, was the pretext for the Leveson inquiry, which was an inquiry not into phone hacking at all, but into what was called the entire culture, ethics and practices of the British press. It was a completely an attempt to kind of purge the whole press, as far as I was concerned, and the phone hacking thing was very much a pretext for that. And alongside that, we had this extraordinary police campaign against tabloid journalists, with more than 50 journalists have now been arrested. Many of them in dawn raids on their houses, where they're, in front of their children, they've had their floorboards pulled up and been dragged off at 6 o'clock in the morning as to prisoners if they were bank robbers or something. Actually, they're tabloid journalists accused of getting dodgy information from a public official somewhere, and not necessarily only phone hacking at all. And I wrote about this, and one of the journalists who'd been arrested made that point to me, that he said, if this was happening in China, there'd be an effing shitstorm here. In other words, the British liberal establishment would be up in arms about a crackdown in an authoritarian society, a kind of mass arrests of journalists. But because it was tabloid journalists, and most of them from the Murdoch press, those quarters weren't really bothered. And the irony is that, now, when the David Miranda thing happens, which is a bloke who was working, he's the partner of a Guardian journalist, he was on a mission working for the Guardian, had some confidential secret state information on him, and was arrested and held for 8 or 9 hours. And there was a huge stink in this from exactly those quarters of the liberal media who've not only kind of shrugged about the persecution of tabloid journalists, some of whom have been kept on police bail for 2 years without being charged with anything, but have actually kind of supported it and demanded more. So I think it's an interesting question, Alan, and it really comes back to the point I was making about this attempt to draw a line and say, no, we're concerned about protecting the freedoms for these people and their opinions and their forms of journalism, but not for these people and their opinions and their forms of journalism. I think it's completely legitimate, because in the end, if you give the authorities the kind of rope to do these kind of things, they're going to use it against you as well.
I've got 2 people there, and then I'm going to come over to Jean Smith next.
Regards to the freedom of religion and freedom of press in terms of tolerance, what you can say based on your religion and how it's perceived in the media, and how you become, in terms of tolerance, you don't have tolerance when making a statement based on your religion in regards to a group of people or an idea that is based on your religion. And also in regards to Mr. Snowden, and what are the protections offered to whistleblowers today, and what is happening in terms of the truth coming out, and what happens to the person that wants to disclose that truth, if I may, to the entire panel.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
There's a book that was published this year by a guy named Greg Lukianov from an organization called FIRE, forget what it stands for, but it's around First Amendment rights in universities. And the book catalogs in great detail the ways in which First Amendment rights in a university setting are being undermined in lots of different ways. And it can be right-wing groups, left-wing groups that can be being attacked for these reasons. And just in May, and this is one of the cases that FIRE has highlighted, just in May, both the Department of Justice and Department of Education issued a ruling on a sexual harassment case at the University of Montana, where it basically stepped in, which arguably, although it's a public university, so I assume that's where they had their basis for doing it, but stepped in this individual case to come up with a ruling that said that it should be a mandate for universities across the country to establish speech codes having to do with sex. And in particular, what it said in that ruling was that sexual offense in matters of sex is basically in the eye of the offendee, that basically it doesn't matter, that an objective person could actually say, this wasn't sexual harassment, it doesn't matter, because it's the individual. And this is a real trampling of First Amendment rights, and in a lot of ways, people's understanding, they learn in college, that's their sort of way they take that into the future, into the public life. And so if these things are happening, I think, like you can say, it's not divisible. You can't sort of say in one area, oh, well, we don't really think the First Amendment really should apply in this arena on campuses when it comes to sexual harassment, and then be surprised that maybe people don't want to really defend First Amendment rights when it comes to other areas like the NSA or some. I've actually, just on the NSA stuff, I've actually been surprised, despite the initial uproar, really how it's been kind of like blasé now. Well, I guess that happens. And I think there's another cultural effect going on there where people don't really value privacy and don't really see, when people voluntarily divulging information on social media and elsewhere, they don't necessarily see the need there to defend from the state the rights to expression.
Thank you. Okay, Jean Smith, please.
I wanted to say something about this question on respect and tolerance, because the way I like to think about it is in terms of what type of world do we want to live in? And I think if we have this sense of making a better world, which is going to go beyond, just drinking that awful fair trade coffee and recycling our garbage, but we've got a real sense of making, a better world, that requires us to have a public debate about that. What type of world do we want to live in? What type of ideas do we think would inform a better world? And the problem with the whole idea about respect and tolerance is I think we should be absolutely allow people to express their ideas, and let's have a discussion about those ideas. But that doesn't mean to say that we should be non-judgmental. So, for example, if you say to me that you're in favor of the fact that Obama has deported more undocumented immigrants than George Bush would have even dreamed of, and that you think that that's a good idea, I'm fine with you saying that. But I'm going to have an argument with you about why I actually disagree with what, with what the government's done on that. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, I think it's important that we clarify the issues. But we've got to get away from this idea that, and I think it's really, with the issue of African Americans, it's the clearest to me that African Americans are so weak and so vulnerable that that just by somehow we say something that they don't like, that they're going to fall apart. And I think the problem with the kind of the change in the cultural tone is that today it's not just that when you say something to somebody, they're worried on the one hand that if you say something bad, this other person, not them, but this other person is going to act in a completely irrational way. But there is also this sense amongst people that people are just very, very vulnerable. People can't handle people disagreeing with them. People can't, handle being called a girl. People can't, handle people just, because I think people always talk about the name calling, but that people can't actually handle someone having an adult conversation with them. And so the way I like to look at it is, number one, I think just by telling somebody to shut up, that's not going to change their point of view. But I think also we've got to get away from this idea that people are so vulnerable and the slightest thing is either going to make somebody tip over the edge and make them go on a rampage, or they're going to completely fall apart. Because if we are actually thinking about building a better world, then we've got to create this, we have to create this public space where we're going to have this conversation. Because to me, that's the whole point about free speech, is so we have this public space where we can have this public conversation about the world we want to live in. And we cannot have that conversation if some people are afraid to say things because they think another person, might not like what they have to say, or they're going to feel offended by their religion or something.
Well,
Yes,
that's
sir.
how I liked what you had to say more than anybody else, because I think, but you said something which in fact we need to fight against, which is that all government is bad. That actually is nonsense.
It's true.
That's right. So we have to understand something which we haven't got time to discuss enough today is why is Obama so bad when in fact he's actually a good guy? What has happened? Because that's what the real thing that's gone wrong at the moment, is that the government is behaving no better than Bush, and that's really appalling.
Okay, thank you. And could you pass it to the front, please? No, this lady at the front.
When it comes to tolerance, I think we might read a book by Elie Wiesel, who said that, and I hope I'm going to quote him properly. He said the word tolerance is no longer in his vocabulary. Because if somebody calls him a dirty Jew, there's no reason to tolerate that. And this goes to something that Jane said too about, I disagree with her. I disagree with what you said about speaking about ill of women or girls or derogatory remarks about the other sex at football games or anywhere else. We have to learn a new vocabulary. But at any rate, Elie Wiesel said, no tolerance. So then what comes next? And what comes next is respect. If you call me a dirty Jew, I do not tolerate you, nor do I respect you, and I walk the hell away from you. I don't even get into conversation, unless it's to save somebody's life or them. So the next thing is somebody will have a discussion about the goodness or the badness of a Jew or an Afro-American or whatever it is. And if you have a respectful discussion, that's fine. But if you can't, if the other person is not even worthy of respect, then he goes to civility. In other words, I won't bring this to fisticuffs, I'll walk away. And I think that's very important. But to your issue, if we don't change our vocabularies, if we don't change our thinking, and if we don't teach our children differently, then, if you keep doing things the same way, things are going to end up the same way.
Thank you. So the woman at the back.
In terms of what was said about, you have the right to express your ideas, somebody else has the right to disagree and sort of, vigorously object. One issue that really interests me is, when does disagreement and vigorous objection sort of cross over into intimidation? Like, it's one thing to say, I really, really disagree with what you said about, the Voting Rights Act. It's something else to say, oh, you have that opinion, that makes you a racist. Or, if you debate something on the issue of, consent in cases of intoxication, you're a rape apologist. If your opinion is, considered to be. So, that's just something I want to raise, because,
Very good point.
Gentleman at the end with the glasses. There's a sense of not treating the audience, the people who read the newspapers or the press in general, not treating them with respect that they deserve, because assuming that they're going to go for the lowest common denominator. But I think that people do believe what they read in newspapers, and I've found it myself. I mean, I've worked in the media for 30 years, and I've been on stories where I've read what's been reported, and it's completely different to what actually happened there on the ground. And yet, I continue to believe what I read in newspapers, and because where else, or online or wherever it may be. And I think it's very easy to forget that we do actually believe what we're told. Even those of us who are critical, we do actually tend to, because that's what we're being told.
So I thought it was a very useful point at the back. Sometimes some journalists I know that have asked questions about the rights for gay rights and for gay marriage who've just raised some questions with it, have been accused of being homophobic. And equally there are examples in other areas. To what extent, so that's a very important question. When does disagreement come into discrimination? the right to be offended. Do we have a right to be offended with no ifs or buts? One of the things that has inspired the New York Salon, as I said, was the original salons, and which came out of the Enlightenment. And on our website, if you look at it, it has a quote from Voltaire that says, I will die for the right for you to say something I disapprove of. I'll die for the right of you to say something that I disapprove of. The idea that what you've got to say, however inflammatory or horrible or nasty or pernicious it is, it's much more important that it's said and we have the discussion and shed the light of debate on it than not. And to what extent is that just an old-fashioned, outdated idea now, and should we be more accommodating to more up-to-date notions of how we respect one another or not? And what, you know, and does that really say something about what kind of world we want to live in? Should we start with you, Eve? Thank you.
So I have just two final thoughts. I appreciate your comment that not all government is bad, and I would like to suggest that one of the aims in all administrations is to enhance what I call the social contract. So there is a general social contract between the press and the government where we both engage in reasonable activity that we are not required to do. So for example, just recently in a small town where we have a newspaper, there was an anonymous phone call leaving a message in the newsroom that the FBI building in that city was going to be blown up. We didn't have a subpoena, we didn't have an obligation, but we had a social contract as citizens, and because we have good sources in the government and we believe we could provide them with this information without harm to our news gathering. So that would be an instance where a good government official said thanks for that information and never would seek to have us part of a trial later for giving us that information. Or in the context of Obama, he was threatened in San Francisco, and we were told by the Secret Service that his life was in danger based on certain information that was coming across our website. We gave them the information about that person because something was going to happen at a certain time of the day. So I do thank you for that comment, because I think we get too black and white in terms of the government, and I think that the social contract is that mechanism to keep a healthy relationship. The second and final point I'd make is that many of the examples we've been talking about, I think, about where you draw the line, is really the same question of where does speech end and where does conduct begin, right? And the law makes those distinctions. It's not always easy, and every fact pattern is different, but if you look at the question of the partner of Snowden that was stopped on his way to Brazil, to me that's very offensive because he was stopped for purposes of his speech and his interest in reporting information. He didn't break a law. Whether you like it or not, and whether you like the British law or not, there are many of the people who were arrested did in fact break the law or were charged with breaking the law. And if they were improperly charged, there's a process by which they can actually challenge that. So again, the line between speech and conduct, reporters and individuals particularly, but journalists have never had the right to break the law, never had to break the law in the name of the First Amendment. So again, all of these examples are really issues of speech, which you are fully protected to engage in, and conduct, which can constantly be flirting with the bounds of the law. So I would only suggest that the area where that dichotomy gets complicated, and I appreciate the comment on whistleblowers, is in the area of whistleblowers. There are very clear legal ways in which a whistleblower like Snowden could have gotten information to people who would have made it public in a more sanitized version. One can debate whether that's good, bad, or indifferent, but I think it's hardest in the context of these type of cases to make that distinction between speech and conduct. But again, that still has to be the analytic framework by which we make those distinctions. And all these examples fit into that.
Thank you, Eve. Stephen?
I think that's great analysis. And yes, there are laws to prevent people from doing things or to punish them if they do them when speech tips over the line. I was just going to bring this back to the sort of the realm that I'm more comfortable in, the philosophical question of whether speech in itself is always justified and whether there are limits, I find makes my head spin, especially when the technological means to express oneself have multiplied 1,000-fold in my own lifetime. But the world in which I work is, I think, to put it mildly, not helping. Jean was talking about, with all these problematic questions, we should find a space in which we can discuss. these questions. I'm afraid that most of us, probably not those of us in this room, but most of us, statistically speaking, are running away from that space and into small or medium-sized echo chambers. The reason why I believe what I read in the newspapers is I read newspapers that tend to reinforce my pre-existing view of the world, and we all do. There are some professional journalists whom I admire, because I'm not one of them, who read everything, and they read papers from all sources, all over the spectrum. And I'm always thinking, I really should do that more, but I don't. And I really should. Most people just don't. And if they're comfortable reading the stuff they're reading, and it's even worse, forgive me, it's even worse in the world of cable television, where people are really paid more the more they express caricatures of the opinions that they think those viewers are going to watch. And people who watch MSNBC don't surf over to Fox News, and vice versa. And that the sort of nichifying of media is, I think, very dangerous. And in a way, it makes me feel good that I work in the embattled, generic broadcast network that I do, because our goal is very simply to try to serve lots of different viewers all the time. And when people accuse us of being liberal and in the pocket of big money on Wall Street at the same time, on the same day, it's an old cliche, but I'm pretty okay with that.
Yeah, right.
Thank you, Stephen. Mick.
Okay, far too many questions. Just to briefly try and answer a couple of the ones. I missed Joel's question about objectivity being used as a way of closing down dissenting opinions by saying what you're saying is not objective, or perhaps something else you hear a lot these days is we're only interested in evidence-based reporting, or the science, capital T, capital S, which is not the same thing as science, but is the science, as a kind of truth that is set up and which cannot be questioned. I much prefer the approach to this of John Stuart Mill, the great English philosopher of the 19th century, who wrote on liberty.
Didn't he have the first edition of The Daily Show, John Stuart Mill?
Exactly, yeah. And he made a very important distinction, which I think we should revive, which is the distinction between accepting something is true because it is continually questioned, and you allow it to be continually questioned, and saying something is true in order to stop it being questioned. I mean, that's a very different. That's two very different attitudes to truth. And question everything is something that we ought to keep to the forefront. Secondly, on journalists breaking the law, journalists do not have any kind of immunity from breaking the law. Journalists do break the law, and no great story in the history of newspapers on either side of the Atlantic would have ever been published if the journalists involved had not been prepared to break the law and the regulations. That includes the Watergate scandal, where they questioned the grand juror and denied that they had done, and the judge told me, if I find out you've been using information from grand juries, you're going to jail. They denied it. They've now admitted that it was the case.
It is true. No, to be true. I happen to be an expert in this area of the law. That is just not a true statement. Okay.
Every single major story ever broken by anybody has involved journalists breaking the law. Even phone hacking, right? Even phone hacking is not. The phone hacking of those victims' phones in Britain. Okay. Yeah. And when the Guardian's main reporter went to the Leveson inquiry, he said, yeah, I've hacked phones, but I do it for ethical reasons, in pursuit of the public interest. Yes, he did. David Lee said that to the Leveson inquiry. Journalists break the law in order to get stories. They also break the law for the wrong reasons, but whether these things are acceptable or not should be judged contextually in the context of that story at that time. The MP's expenses scandal in Britain, a huge scandal, which rocked the whole political establishment, involved the illegal getting of information by the Daily Telegraph and paying for it, which is completely illegal under bribery legislation, which is now being used against tabloid journalists. So we should be very careful about having a black and white thing about journalists don't break the law. Journalists have to have judgment calls in the specific context and say this is worth it or that's not worth it. And generally speaking, you don't have any immunity, but there's sometimes you have to cross the line in order to get the story. I want to say one more thing, which is about. Two more things, actually. Have I got time to say more things?
Quickly, please.
Okay, one more thing. Right.
Me too.
Time to go home.
Sorry, yeah, we're supposed to finish at 9 o'clock, weren't we?
That's what I told my wife.
Let's go.
Okay, we're going to get
One more thing.
point.
Okay, I'll forget about the right to be offensive. I was going to talk about that. I just want to talk about this thing about all
You made the
governments
point.
are
We
the
get
same.
that one. We do get that.
All governments are the same, you know, and right or left, whatever. What I find now in politics is that what worries me the most is that those people who call themselves the left are actually worse on these issues. In Britain, it is those who call themselves the left who have been most forthright in their pursuit of everything from regulating the press to speech codes, left, right and centre. And as an old man of the left think of myself as a libertarian Marxist, you know, I find this completely distasteful. I now find myself in a ridiculous situation where the one person I can agree with in the debate about the press in Britain this week is Michael Gove, the Tory Education Secretary, who used to work for Rupert Murdoch, and is the one person who's defended the right of the Daily Mail to publish insulting stories about the Labour leader, the Labour Party and the left, and think that the Daily Mail ought to be closed down as a fascist institution for doing this. So it's a really weird world we live in, where those who call themselves liberal and left-wing, and what I'd like to do is to revive an idea of a left liberalism, which comes from my old friend Karl Marx, who I quoted in the Columbia Journalism Review online this week, who made the point in the very first thing that he ever published in the 1840s, which was a defence of the freedom of the press against the Prussian state censors, that you cannot enjoy the advantages of a free press without putting up with its inconveniences. And as he put it most poetically, you cannot grasp the rose without its thorns.
I'd like to thank the panel for a great discussion tonight. Thank you very much. I just want to say a couple of things. We're going to go for a drink after at Le Monde, the brasserie, between 111th and 112th, in the spirit of carrying on the discussion and debate and argument. One of the reasons we wanted to do this debate very much both at a university and a place of journalism was because of this very discussion. And often in the New York Salon and these debates, we raise more questions than we answer. It's not about getting a right answer. It's about interrogating and arguing often and being, you know, working out and working through. It was very concerning to us that at debates, things like Holocaust deniers or even global warming deniers, it seemed to us, were often used in a way to shut down speech, and we're very much into encouraging debate and speech. I grew up with the idea of sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. It's become slightly unfashionable now. But I'd invite you to come along and join us and come for a drink and carry on a discussion.